There is a handbag you cannot buy. You can want it. You can afford it. You can walk into the boutique and ask by name. They will smile, take your contact information, and tell you to wait. Some customers wait months for a Hermès Birkin. Some wait years. There is no official queue. Access depends entirely on your purchase history with the boutique. The price begins in the tens of thousands. Some pieces sell at auction for hundreds of thousands more, but Hermès makes enough Birkins. They simply choose not to sell them to you yet. That manufactured scarcity, the engineered feeling that you almost can't have this, is the most valuable product in the history of commerce. One man saw this before almost anyone else. He didn't invent luxury. He didn't design clothes or blend cognac or craft leather. He did something more disruptive than any of that. He reverse-engineered desire itself. He turned the psychology of exclusivity into an industrial process. And he built a company now worth over $400 billion on a single uncomfortable truth. What people are really buying is not the object. It is the feeling of the object. His name is Bernard Arnault, and what follows is the story of how he built LVMH. In 1854, a man named Louis Vuitton opened a workshop in Paris. He made trunks, not decorative objects, functional, precision-built travel trunks for an era when a journey to the Americas took weeks and your luggage needed to survive it. His innovation was a flat lid, which stacked. His rivals used rounded tops. It was a practical decision that quietly announced a philosophy. Louis Vuitton made things that worked better and looked better doing it. By the early 20th century, his initials, LV, woven into a monogram canvas, were being copied everywhere. Counterfeiters were already taking the pattern as a compliment. The house responded by treating its logo as a legal property, an object of defense, a mark worth protecting. Something was forming, not just a brand, but a territory. Across France, a parallel world of heritage was taking shape. Moet and Chandon had been making champagne since 1743. Hennessy had been producing cognac since 1765. These were not luxury brands in the modern marketing sense. They were simply old, and old in France meant something. When Moet Hennessy and Louis Vuitton merged in 1987 to form LVMH, the new company had about 10 maisons, 12,000 employees, and roughly 3 billion euros in revenue. It was a marriage of heritage houses, united by prestige and a handshake understanding that rarity was worth protecting. Nobody fully understood yet that rarity could be manufactured. That understanding was coming from an unlikely direction. A 35-year-old builder's son from Roubaix, in northern France, who had no background in fashion, no craft heritage, and no patience for the slow rhythms of the old luxury world. He had something else, a theory. In 1978, a French textile empire called Boussac sans frères collapsed. Boussac was one of the largest industrial conglomerates in France. It employed around 20,000 workers, and buried inside its sprawling balance sheet, almost invisible under layers of debt and loss-making textile operations, was a single asset of extraordinary value: Christian Dior. The bankruptcy left Dior and Le Bon Marché, the famous Parisian department store, effectively in the hands of the French state. It was an embarrassing situation for a government that had built its identity partly on the prestige of French culture, a crown jewel held inside a burning building. For 6 years, the government searched for a buyer. The condition was explicit: preserve the workers, protect the jobs. France had 20,000 people depending on Boussac's survival, and any buyer would have to account for them. In 1984, Bernard Arnault learned that the government was looking for someone to take Boussac sans frères off its hands. He was 35. His family ran a construction business in Roubaix. He had spent several years managing property in the United States, watching American business culture from the outside. Its impatience, its willingness to restructure, its indifference to sentimentality about legacy employees. He came back to France with a different idea of what a company could be. He saw Boussac the way a surgeon sees a patient. The diagnosis was already clear. The textile operations were unsalvageable. But Dior, that was something else entirely. He called his banker at Lazare Frères, and he made an offer. The formal purchase price for the Boussac empire was 1 franc, 1 symbolic franc, plus the assumption of a mountain of debt, plus commitments to the French state about jobs, investment, and future profit sharing. Arnault and his family put up about $15 million of their own money to gain the initial foothold. Lazard Frères, Worms and Company, and a syndicate of investors provided the rest. Roughly 360 million francs in recapitalized equity. After negotiating approximately 40% haircuts on Boussac's creditors, Arnault emerged with just over 50% control. He had acquired one of the most famous names in fashion for the cost of a single coin and a handshake promise. Then he did what he had always intended to do. Over the next 2 years, Arnault sold nearly every Boussac business except two, Christian Dior and Le Bon Marché. He eliminated approximately 9,000 workers. The French press responded with a nickname that would follow him for years, Le Terminator. The government felt betrayed, but the math was unforgiving. The alternative was returning a money-losing conglomerate to state control and firing the same workers themselves. Arnault had understood something the government had not. The value of Boussac was not the 20,000 people it employed. It was the name on the label. By 1987, the stripped-down Dior Corps was generating roughly $112 million in profit on $1.9 billion in revenue. The transformation had taken 3 years. Arnault was 38 years old. He had just learned that the formula worked, and he had much bigger plans. The merger that created LVMH in 1987 was not a clean handshake between equals. Louis Vuitton's family shareholders and Moet Hennessy's management had joined forces to protect themselves from Bernard Arnault. They had watched the Dior story and understood what he did to companies he acquired. When Arnault began buying LVMH shares through his holding company, the existing shareholders tried to block him. By 1989, they had failed. Arnault controlled LVMH, and then the machinery started running. Kenzo in 1993, Guerlain in 94, Celine in 96, Sephora in 96, Tag Heuer in 99, Fendi in 2001. Each acquisition followed the same logic. Find a brand with a mythology, absorb it into the LVMH structure, accelerate its distribution while protecting its story of exclusivity. The prices escalated with the ambition. Bulgari, in 2011, cost $5.2 billion. Tiffany & Company, the American jewelry house founded in 1837, was acquired in 2021 for $16.2 billion, the largest acquisition in luxury history. From 10 maisons and 3 billion euros in revenue when LVMH was formed, the company grew to more than 75 maisons and 84.7 billion euros in revenue by 2024. The peak market capitalization exceeded $400 billion. But the number that matters most is not the total, it is the ratio. Each new acquisition added not just revenue, it added another story of scarcity. Another brand that could raise prices 5 to 10% a year, forever, because the story said it was worth it. There was one house Arnault could not buy. Hermès, founded in 1837, makers of the Birkin bag, the Kelly bag, the silk scarves that hang in every international airport, was controlled by the Hermès family. They had structured their ownership deliberately to resist outside acquisition. They believed their house was protected. Arnault studied the structure and found a gap. Between 2008 and 2010, LVMH quietly accumulated a position in Hermès, not by purchasing shares on the open market. That would have triggered disclosure requirements. Instead, Arnault used cash-settled equity swaps and other derivatives, financial instruments that provided economic exposure to Hermès stock without technically triggering the ownership thresholds that would have required public reporting. For nearly 3 years, LVMH built its position in the dark. On October 23, 2010, LVMH disclosed that it had accumulated a 14.2% stake in Hermès. If the derivatives were converted, the position could reach 17.1%. The effect was immediate and electric. The Hermès family, who had slept soundly believing their house was unconquerable, woke up to find that the most aggressive acquirer in the history of luxury had been at the gate for 3 years without anyone knowing. Hermès scrambled. The family created a holding structure, the H51 pooling 50% of Hermès shares among family members to create a blocking stake. They filed suit, they lobbied regulators, they called it an attack on French industrial heritage. The Autorité des marchés financiers, the French market regulator, opened an investigation in November 2010. Years of legal combat followed. In December 2014, the case concluded. LVMH was required to distribute its Hermès shares to its own shareholders rather than retaining the stake. The position was unwound. Arnault did not get Hermès, but he had entered the position at a cost of roughly $1.5 billion. By the time he was forced to exit, the shares had appreciated significantly. He walked away with a profit estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars. He had turned a failed acquisition attempt into one of the most profitable financial operations in corporate history. For a few days in October 2010, he had held the most coveted luxury house in the world at 17%, and discovered that even Hermès had a price. It was just higher than what regulators would allow. Today, LVMH reports 84.7 billion euros in annual revenue, 17 brands in fashion and leather goods, wines and spirits, perfumes, watches, jewelry, selective retail, more than 200,000 employees, presence in every major luxury market on Earth. At its peak, the company was worth more than $400 billion, making Bernard Arnault briefly the wealthiest person alive. And the mechanism that drives all of it is the same mechanism he identified 40 years ago: the industrialized production of scarcity. Louis Vuitton has never run a sale, never. Not in 170 years. Instead, the brand does something else. It raises prices, regularly, predictably, year after year. The Neverfull handbag sold for around $1,320 in June of 2018. By 2024, the same bag cost $2,240. That is a 70% increase in 6 years, through periods of recession, pandemic, and war. The brand also reportedly destroys unsold inventory to prevent it from reaching the secondary market at a discount. Maintaining the perception of scarcity requires removing the evidence that the goods are not, in fact, scarce. Here is what the secondary market reveals. Pre-owned Louis Vuitton bags typically trade at 30 to 60% below current retail prices. The Neverfull that costs $2,200 new often sells for $700 to $1,000 used. The market for nearly new, barely touched handbags at half price exists at enormous scale. This is the acidic fact at the center of the entire model. The scarcity is in the story, not the supply. Louis Vuitton manufactures enough bags to satisfy demand. It simply prices them, distributes them, and markets them in a way that sustains the feeling of exclusivity, regardless of the underlying reality. That is not fraud. It is genius. It is also something close to the purest distillation of what a brand actually is. Not a product, but a story people pay to be inside. There is a conversation that almost never happens in a Louis Vuitton boutique. The salesperson does not say, "This bag is made in a factory." It is made by skilled artisans, yes, but many of them working in facilities that scale to meet demand. The monogram canvas has been produced by machine for over a century. The price you are paying is not for the material, it is not for the time, it is for the story. And the remarkable thing is, you probably already know this. Every person who has ever bought a luxury good at full price, on some level, knows they are paying for a feeling. The buyers are not deceived. They are paying consciously for the right to participate in a narrative about who they are. Bernard Arnault did not exploit that. He engineered it, at scale, across 75 brands, for 40 years. The uncomfortable question the LVMH story leaves behind is not whether luxury is fake. The uncomfortable question is, what does it tell us about desire? That the most valuable thing a company can manufacture is scarcity itself. Louis Vuitton opened his workshop in 1854 and made trunks that worked better than anyone else's. 170 years later, the company bearing his name makes the feeling of wanting a trunk. The craft was always real. The scarcity was always a choice.